Hey, fellow Gianteers, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So we are back to doing our little relationship series and probably the big closer on this, the big finale. We're going to talk a little bit about Jung, but maybe in a special way. And we always knew we were going to do this because we wanted to talk about it in a way that's kind of very personal, especially ways that maybe a little bit more personal about our own lives, especially me.
Right,
So
yeah.
this might be like the episode that'd be called Eric's scariest episode. It's like I think it's the only one of the things I think I ever really felt nervous about talking about, though I think the minute we started this podcast, we knew eventually we'd have this conversation. So this has
Mhm.
been a 3-year build
The
for this thing.
question really is, Eric, is if you continue after this. That's the real question.
Do I just quit? No,
Yeah.
I want to talk more.
Okay. Yeah.
I want to talk more. And then we all have our reveals. So we all got our things we want to talk about that are close to the heart. I wanted at the very beginning, though, I have a couple preamble things, and Daniel was kidding before we started the actual recording about how this is so indicative of my personality. Because I'll say, hey, I want to talk about this thing, and I'll talk about 4 other things first,
Yes.
which is very true. But I had like these preamble things, as I think, unless doing this, it doesn't make any sense. The first thing I wanted to do real quick, though, and we'll see how fast this goes, whether we break this up into 2 separate episodes or not, it's kind of a debate. Might be a 2-parter, you know. But I wanted to thank Daniel for his patience in doing this, and for the people listening and doing this. This has actually been kind of a great experience for me prepping these episodes, all the things we do, but especially this little thing, because for whatever weird karmic reason, this is all really close to my personal heart. And so this has been something, really important. So I just wanted to thank you, Daniel, my brother,
Of course.
for being supportive in this, right? And like I said, it's probably the only one where I'm really kind of nervous about it. I think I've done some other kind of cringy episodes even recently, just as a foreshadowing and a little bit of prep. But anyways, that's what it is. Okay, on the preliminaries, I think just as a kind of a personal announcement thing, I think this has been so interesting for me, the whole series of episodes. I'm going to try to write it up as a little book, but I hopefully think will be one of our first G&T books. Maybe we'll have like G&T Press or something. Dan and I have been talking about doing books around the show, and I want us to write, and we both want us to write something together. This thing is kind of burning a hole in my head, though, that I feel like I have to do it. And, Daniel and I understand this on this point. I think when we're both kind of passionate people, and when something really grabs you, you feel like you got to do it. So I think I'm grateful for Daniel for being supportive of that too, right? I think the thing that's been really interesting for me in this, and that's something I'm curious your feedback about this, Daniel, is I think with the Jung thing, I've done this deep dive into his works now, and especially the Memories, Dreams, Reflections, this sort of semi-autobiography. And I think it's not that I feel like I've been exactly even influenced by him. He was sort of like a peripheral figure in some ways in my life, though important in some very specific ways that I'll talk about in these episodes. But it's more like I had the feeling like not so much being affected by him exactly, but more this experience of like, if you are a certain kind of person who asks a certain set of questions, you'll come up with really similar conclusions. So the strange thing for me has been looking at like, his life and going, God, I think I was asking similar questions, coming up with similar kinds of answers, just in a kind of a parallel way. Not that I was kind of reading him and like trying to follow him in that way or something, but more just like, hey, I think we had something similar brewing inside. And again, led to similar questions and then similar answers. Does that make sense to you, Daniel?
Yeah, I think.
You have that experience with anybody where you feel like, okay, it
You mean
seems like we're,
in terms of like a historical,
yeah,
or
maybe.
or even
Yeah.
an author, contemporary
Yeah.
author?
Something like that. Do you have anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I can say that, and maybe this is also relatable to people. You probably have this with people who in your life. Now, you're on similar wavelengths. You'll call and talk to somebody you haven't talked to in a while, find out you guys are into the same thing or studying the exact same thing, like at the current time, or you're in school and you talk to somebody else from your cohort and find out you have very similar interests.
Yeah.
That's happening concurrently. So I think that's one. But then I think also, like, I think we're drawn towards teachers. We can call Jung a teacher, in this part of his existence. We're drawn towards teachers or teachings that resonate with us. and that, you know, we may take something else from them than besides what they're trying to put forth. But I think what's interesting is that when you were talking about this before we started recording, and then we were talking about the book, it's about where you're coming from, right? Not necessarily the how it's presented or the answers that come, but it's the place that you're coming from, the specific like location, if you want to call it this, like this kind of energetic place. And so you're coming from this particular place, therefore your viewpoint is coming from that spot, right? So if I am standing 50 feet away from you, you're not going to hear my voice. You're only going to hear me yelling, and you're always going to sound, my voice is always going to sound quite distorted because you're only going to hear my voice yelling. But then when I come up and I get close to you, you're gonna be like, oh, you sound different now. I'm like, well, yeah, because I'm standing closer. I don't have to yell. You know, so like when someone puts forth a work of art or a creative work, it is about their, I mean, at least in my interpretation, they're trying to creatively channel the place from which they're coming from, the energy of that feeling or that position. I keep using positionality, but of that particular place. You know what I'm saying? And so I feel like there are similar places that we come from. I'm saying the same thing as you, just in a different way. That when we're working through something, either in life or in our, you know, relationship, work, whatever, creatively, spiritually, however, that when that has probably been experienced by numerous people before and concurrently, but when we find people who reflect that back to us in their work, then it's a nice mirror, you know, and you get to see yourself sort of externally reflected back to yourself via someone else's creativity. If that,
he had an influence on me in some ways when I was younger, and I'll talk about that. But then I kind of like put him down. I didn't really think I mean, I thought about his work at different times. I've taught it for years in classes and stuff. So he's been on my mind somewhat, but I don't think I really thought about it as like, wow, there's a real parallelism in some of the questions he was asking and then the answers. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And that made me think about a book where you can kind of look at a little bit kind of telling your own life, but I mean, who cares about me that much? But you can talk about like Jung, and you can say, yeah, there's something about this that he kind of creates maybe almost like a template for a certain kind of attitude towards life, you know? And I just find that really interesting. And I hadn't really thought about that before. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit.
Well, that place that he is, you know, touching on has more relevance to you now for where you are.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I guess that's something I'll explore as I go along, and we'll see what it's like in the episode. I think there was sort of like a hidden parallelism or something that I wasn't really aware of. It's strange. It's a strange experience. Like, and it can go back at even some of the details. Like he grew up in this rural community in this religious household, and like I did too. And you know, there's this funny stuff where I'm like, you know, interesting. You know. So, anyways, okay. The next big thing for me on the docket was something I thought was really important to talk about too. And we kind of kicked this around pre-show as being kind of an important idea. That's kind of like okay to disagree. So as I was like thinking about the questions involved in all of this for me, relationships, love, what does it mean? How do different people approach it? We talked about like some famous psychologists. We talked about Esther Perel and Freud and Reich and Jung and Carl Rogers floating around there too. I also talked to a lot of people just in my life that I know, patients and friends and family. And like, I got to the point where I was like, okay, there's just a lot of individual difference within this, which on the one hand is kind of obvious, but I started really thinking about it kind of, I guess, to my mind, what is maybe a deeper Taoist way of thinking about it. Beings have their own natures. You know, if you're a Taoist, you say a sparrow's a sparrow, a hawk's a hawk, a frog's a frog. You know, they're all going to have their own kind of particular ways of being in the world. And I think the depth and profundity of that really hit me in a deeper way than maybe I would have like felt before. And even at something like this, like you and I, Daniel, we don't have to agree about these questions even that we're going to be talking about, but it's like totally okay. You know, I love you like a brother. And it's all fine, you know. And I actually talked to my own biological brother about this, and we don't feel the same way, but that's all okay too. And it was amazing, like getting that place was actually really healing. I'll share it with about my brother too once we get a little bit further what it was like. But you know, my brother and I talked through a lot of these things as well. My uncle passed away last year, almost going on a year now, and we spent a lot of time taking care of my uncle together, and we had a lot of deep conversations, as a lot of times happens. If you've been in this situation with like a sick relative, you end up going through and spending a lot of time with family and friends, and you get to know people in this much deeper way. It's kind of moving, right? my mom like would say my uncle would be really happy that his passing brought my brother and I so close, something like that. And so it was a kind of like a very moving experience on so many levels. But my brother and I found we had really kind of hard, difficult conversations about some of these things, but they were very healing, and a lot of it just had to do with like accepting, like, okay, we don't agree, but that's okay, which is, I think, a profound point,
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about that, when you just were visiting your own brother, we were talking about that. So just the importance of having those relationships and having those agreeings and disagreeings. I'm
Yeah,
not sure where you and I fully disagree. There are places where we don't totally agree. We
sure.
agree on a lot,
Yeah.
but there's places where there's a little bits of like difference of how we think about things. And just the acceptance of how okay that is. There's something powerful about that. Does that make
Yeah.
sense to you?
It's an important point. We kind of talked about this before we started recording, so we can kind of get into it a little bit, but no two people are going to agree 100% with anybody, with each other. That's just first and foremost. And we talk about on this podcast and with our own individual friends and students and patients and whomever else, people, anybody who's willing to listen, really. um about not just our views, like personal, but like I think, at least I think, I can't speak for you, but I think many of the things I believe, I feel like I have sought out and then inherited because I sought them out. There was something inside of me that was looking for, hey, I can't put words to this feeling, so I'm going to look around and see if anybody else feels this kind of a way. Oh, look, yes, not only is there one person, there's like thousands of people, and they call it this particular philosophy. So now that has kinship with me. But even within that, there's differentiations, but amongst the different schools and different practitioners, and even myself, and even people who learn with me at the same time from the same person. So there's always going to be a little bit differences. The point is not necessarily that there is differences, it's how you live with it. And I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a patient of mine who's a really nice guy, and we ended up having some really deep conversations. And I always go out of my way to thank my patients when they come in and we get to have real conversations about real things. They're like, oh, thank you so much for your wisdom. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I want to thank you for even opening the space such that we can have this conversation, because I'm reminding myself of things that I believe in via a different person who doesn't necessarily, quote unquote, agree with me. They are of a different mind, and they ask different questions, and they're not going to just take what I say at face value, but they are going to think about it and then go, I don't know, that seems real, not real, or whatever the case is. Fine. This is good learning. But it's learning in a dynamic kind of a way that's interpersonal, and it's relationship based. And so I feel like even if someone agrees with what I'm saying in principle, there could still be differences. And even if they disagree with what I'm saying, they still might find my points valid. They just don't hold the same kind of beliefs. But more importantly is that we can kind of look at each other respectfully and go, I can still learn from you. Right. And the importance is taking that kind of opportunity to learn, even when it's difficult. I'm saying, even when we don't agree, even when there's dissonance, if you will. And I find that to be kind of like a really important piece, that you're kind of talking about here with this, like disagreeing, agreeing to disagree.
Well, I think you and I are both like authenticity addicts or junkies or something like that. We really love this authenticity, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this recently in some
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah.
Like you will refuse to be inauthentic in episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I try to set you up, you're like, no, I'm not going there, dude. It doesn't feel real to me. I'm not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It has to feel real, right? In this way. And I think, when you get to these points of being real, and I had difficult conversations with people about some of these things recently, where there's a little heat behind them, and but that's when you're getting to the points that are important, and a lot of it had to do with the fact of like, okay, I'm going to accept this person and what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's not, and this is the non-judgment part, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we're going to kind of take it with a judgmental attitude. I don't want to be judged. I don't think other people want to be judged. Right.
Right.
I get the feeling like this is how Jung kind of did his psychotherapy. Apparently he didn't keep any clinical notes for when his offspring said, his heirs of his materials. There weren't clinical files. And he didn't even have like a specific philosophy all the time that was consistent of how he would handle patients. His thing was like, let me sit here. Carl Rogers, the same idea, maybe. Let me sit here and be an authentic presence, and I'll try to bring this authenticity out of this other person. And along the way, they'll discover who they are, and it'll help me discover who I am.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's a point of gratitude for everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay, so on the point of potential disagreement
Yeah.
between you and me.
Well, before you go there,
Okay. Yeah. Before I go there, okay.
One part, I think it's just to drive this point home, and you mentioned it, but that like, and it's in your notes here too, so I want to just touch on it, that it is, you can agree or disagree, it doesn't matter, but the point of acceptance, non-judgmental, is an important point. And you know, I think they're, at least in like sort of like the, I'm not going to call it modern spirituality, whatever the bullshit people are selling on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube, whatever that garbage is. I want to touch it occasionally, you know, and not that everybody is garbage or bullshit. Some people are coming from a good place. I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying some of it, you know, is kind of hokey.
I have to say, I'm like so distanced from this. I don't even know what this stuff would look
Yeah,
like.
I'm like, I got my pinky toe in it, like
It
just
is what it
barely
is. Yeah.
pinky toe.
I didn't know how to make any kind of opinions about that.
Yeah, I just, you know, like they'll talk about these concepts, but it's almost like, you know, they'll say, oh, well, you know, being critical, being judgmental, they loop those things in the same loop, but it's not actually, they're not the same thing. Being, at least in my mind, being judgmental is like you standing separate from the issue, being a judge, right? Doing the polarity, right? Doing a dualistic viewpoint, good, bad, that's it. Cause that's what judges do. Yes, no, you know, right. Whereas being critical, yes, you could totally be judgmental and criticize, right? Meaning not only do I disagree with you, but I'm going to criticize and tell you why you're wrong, right? However, if you can disagree with somebody and then critique how that disagreement resonates with you, now you're using, instead of being critical, you're having critical thinking, right? And you're able to kind of see how that resonates and fits with you, and where it is that you can shift your own sense of maybe being a little bit more soft or being a little bit more open to at least embrace their viewpoint, even if you don't believe in it, but say, okay, I can be compassionate to understanding who you are and where you are, and extending you the benefit of the doubt, even if I believe you're wrong, but I'm not going to hold that against you. I'm not going to judge in that way. You know what I'm saying? And so
you'll still have an acceptance of that person.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Even though you know, and then there's a way in which you can go like, okay, I don't believe that for this and this and that reasons for me. But that doesn't mean that what this other person is doing is somehow wrong for them.
Correct.
They got their own reasons, right?
Got their own reasons. And even if what they're doing is detrimental to them, right? Let's say it's a bad habit or some kind of addiction or whatever, and you know it's not good for them. It's verifiably not good. They're gambling incessantly. What makes you think that the words that you're going to say to them right now are going to make any difference? Of course, you're going to give impassioned speech or try some words to try and help them because you're a nice person, hopefully, but they've heard it. It's their own issue. You know what I'm saying? Like, they have to be willing to come to the table and ask for your assistance. You can't always just give. Here's what I think. Like, let me give you the gift of me. You're welcome.
Such a deep thing because, you know, maybe it's a whole nother set of episodes. I'll save it for some other time, but like definitely clinically, this happens all the time, right? I had things I could tell this person, but they're probably not going to listen to me. I mean, I teach whole classes on it.
Yeah.
You know, like unless you have a real bond and a transference and the person wants to hear what you're saying, they didn't hire you to be, you know, their head shrinker.
Yeah.
So they might not be interested in your opinion.
And so, and I'm
paying you professionally to do anything.
And I'm mentioning all of this because, you know, I'm maybe building it more than we should be, you know, but like, you know, as we continue and we get to the eventual, you know, reveal of what it is that, you know, some of your beliefs and that like people can have their own judgment, right? Because there are all things that we do that are probably outside of the kind of ideology of society or what society wants the automaton robots to be doing in their lives, because they're more easily controlled and can buy more shit that way. And not everybody believes everything. So there has to be some level of practice being in dissonance. And it's so much easier to do that with people whom you have, like you said, this connection with, this bond with, to do that in a kind of a nice held space. And so you might as well start practicing, because inevitably at some point in your life, you're going to start a podcast and then decide to start sharing things about yourself.
You want to do it in a non-judgmental way, so everyone doesn't give you a bunch of shit.
That's right.
Now, the societal question is a big one. You
Yeah.
kind of brought it up. So that was another one I had in my notes here. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure where we agree or disagree on this totally. It's a little funny for me because if I'm honest about, my spirituality, psychology, how I see the world, for me, it's kind of axiomatic that there's going to be this conflict. It's very deep part of me that to be an individual person, you're going to have to like remove yourself from the toxic parts of the societal influences. And it's
Yeah.
just so deep. If I was writing, this is idea of stages of the path, lamrim in Buddhist philosophy, the things you have to learn. And this would be like part of my own personal lamrim, which is probably what we're writing in this podcast anyways, a kind of a personal lamrim over time. But for me, it's like, it's true in the psychologists that I really like, and some of the people we talked about, like Jung and Reich and Rank, and even Carl Rogers talks this way.
Right.
I was passing on some Carl Rogers stuff to someone, and I was looking through his ideas, and there's a part where he's like saying, if you want to be authentic, when you become authentic, you won't follow things from the outside as much. You'll have your own internal compass. You'll do it for yourself.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those things matter. And I think in the spiritual traditions that ultimately I gravitated towards, Zen or Taoism, I think especially Chuangzi, I have like multiple quotes that are on the shower curtain of wisdom across the hall, and are like things that I drop into classes where Chuangzi is going like, if you let society do this to you, it will fuck your head up. That's not as poetical as the way he says it. There'll be some butterflies and
close enough
things. But it gets to the essence of it, right? It's going to screw your head around. And I think Buddhist Tantra is like this too. Tantra in general, there's this whole acknowledgement, like you have to get away from, it's almost like you like Carlos Castaneda, and it's almost like you have to get your power back. It's stolen your power.
Yes.
By getting your mind wrapped around stuff that may not really be true, and you have to steal that power back, right? And in that case, you empower yourself.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of that tantric stuff, is like empower yourself back, steal the power back that's been taken from you from these institutions. So it's across the board. It's also true of the arts that I love. Like I mentioned Henry Miller. He's very much like this. I had a conversation about Philip K. Dick the other day. I don't know if you like him or not, Dan. You like him as a writer?
I don't know. No, I don't know him well enough.
He's the guy who wrote the book behind like Blade Runner. So
that's why okay, there we go.
Yeah. But anyways, I was having this conversation about Philip K. Dick, and he has this whole thing like the empire never ended. That's one of his really famous quotes, right? And he really means like the structure of the Roman Empire, or the structure of authoritarianism, can always repeat itself. So you can always find yourself under things that are kind of authoritarian at different times. The empire never really ends. It just keeps going on, right? And these forces are negative, and in some ways, as an individual, you have to pull yourself out of it. Again, writing a book on Jung, he's all over this point. Like, he really cares about this a lot. And he has this deep idea that you have to individuate yourself. Partially that's like not being held back by your own internal psychological baggage. But part of that's also like not being dominated by the external world to the point where it kind of forces a false version of yourself upon you. It's real deep to me. So I don't know. I don't know where we agree or don't or disagree on this. I wrestle with it myself, so I'll continue on with that. But let me throw the mic over to you. Where do you think we agree and disagree, I guess?
No, I mean, I think I think on that we agree totally, to be totally honest. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's always like the language, right, is where the language, right? Because when someone says individual, to be individualized, right? That's I don't want people to think that that's we're saying individualized, right? And that like you are establishing yourself as because I think sometimes, at least in it's how I'm just going to say what I think.
Yeah.
That I like the projection that my mind does is that when someone hears empowerment and individualized and leaving of society or right, that like you are thereby becoming your own one person society, right? And that might be, in a sense, the first step, right, into becoming free of the, as we've talked about this, like societal plague, if you will, right?
Yeah.
That goop that's sort of on your unconscious, your psychological unconscious, your psychonscious. But like that is from a tantric perspective, from a an enlightenment practical perspective, an enlightenment philosophical traditional perspective, that is part of the path along the way. It is not the end stage. So I want to keep that in the not the rearview mirror, but in the perspective looking forward. So removing the power that they have over us from birth, and then taking that upon yourself to become a Freemason, right, if you will, to make your own decisions, to be at the top of the pyramid with your eye open,
Or you
right?
could say a shaman, right? To be
Yeah,
a
or
shaman.
a shaman, or a yogi,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever,
Yeah, I think the Jung thing on that, and this is like obviously like a Buddhist compassion thing too, is, he spent his whole life writing these long ass books, trying to communicate some of his insights to other people, and then trying to work with patients to help them go through whatever their process was. So I get what you're saying. I mean, I suppose you could think, well, kind of be an individual. It doesn't mean to become a jerk, right?
No,
Or to become, like a narcissistic person or something like that.
correct.
I think the confidence in Carl Jung or Carl Rogers or Wilhelm Reich, who we talked about, or Rado Rank, or whoever these people are, along with like spiritual past too, is that the more you get to be who you are, just like naturally you want to help other people along their own trajectories too. And you'll more naturally want to do that. That's more what human nature is actually about. It's not like we're all a bunch of narcissistic dingbats,
Correct.
asshats.
That's why I said
like it's not like that. Well, what will actually come out will be something that's much more compassionate and willing to share and give and try to support, love and support, right? Yeah.
And I can just share from the last like month and a half of various ceremonial spaces that I have helped or held personally or been a part of. I have been, fortunately the recipient of some really beautiful compliments. And, like the Buddhist tradition will say, compliments, good compliments, bad compliments, let them both go like the wind, something like this, like a breeze, or however they describe it. And so you do your best to not be criticized, to not let someone's critique of you ruin your day. And also to not let someone's compliment of you boost yourself so high that, you can't come back on the ground. So I keep all this in mind. But the deepest compliments at this point for me are not like somebody bowing to my feet for whatever reason, you know what I'm saying, or whatever, but them being happy to be around me because I am myself, or they perceive me to be me, and that they are just, that makes them feel more confident in being their own self. And it took me a minute to kind of like understand what somebody was saying. They're like, oh man, I'm just so happy that I'm grateful that I get to be around you as you're being you. And I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, just doing what you do, it's you. And I'm like, okay. They're like, yeah, exactly. I'm like, well, what are you saying? They're like, no, that's what I'm saying. You're you. And that's cool. I like that. Thank you. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And they're like,
that's like the authenticity in one person that brings out the authenticity in another person.
Exactly. That's exactly the point.
And I think if you can get like, because I guess if there's another principle that we would throw out there that I think we both agree on, is like non-hierarchicalism.
Yeah.
If you can bust out of this non-hierarchicalism that one person has to sort of put themselves above the other person, that's probably intrinsically toxic. There's something just wrong with that, probably at the root.
Yeah.
No matter where you find that, in any part of the human world or something, there's something just wrong with that, obviously. And probably it's wrong in like chimps and gorillas, and it's just fucked up everywhere. Gibbons, and there's something wrong with the whole thing. So yeah, I kind of get that idea, because when that happens, you're not trying to establish some hierarchy over some other person where I'm the
You're
person
not trying.
Yeah.
But I think
that's even true, like within the family thing. Like I don't want to put myself even in, like I have to be the like sort of the dad to my kids. So sometimes I have to be like, okay, you have to follow me just because I'm your dad. I'm sorry, that's how it is.
Right.
But in general, I don't want it to be like I'm the authority person and you have to kind of like live under my weight or something. No, it's bad for people.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So okay. So I wasn't sure if there's stuff we disagree about.
But the only thing, just on the note of that relationship, when you are just because I don't have kids, but I have friends, lots of friends and family members who have kids. Teaching people boundaries is important. you know. And Remy talked about this a little bit with people who come in to their center who are, you know, sort of just spiritual practitioners of any ilk. You know, they don't have a particular practice, or they're just doing whatever. Is that they don't have the kind of boundaries to help guide them down any particular path. They could choose whatever path they want, but that they're sort of like very windy. They're movable almost too easily. So there is a blending of like not feeling like someone is pointing down at you, you know, and that you're more standing parallel. But then I think also from the perspective of talking earlier about agreeing to disagree with somebody who you have a common relationship with, that you're holding space for them. You know, you're holding space for their opinion, but that you're also holding space for their expansion, so that they do know that there are boundaries for them to kind of work within to move towards. You know what I'm saying? Like the I guess a
But that sounds
bumper.
like having direction or something. That's like
Yeah,
something that would come from in Chinese medicine. We talk about the idea of the Hun, the spirit that has to do with the wood phase, and it gives you direction of where you need to go. I think
yeah,
sometimes people like kind of directionless.
yeah,
I'm going to say this word boundaries because they got a special Esther Perel thing to say about the word boundaries
sure.
that I didn't put in the notes because I just listened to it last night. So
Yeah,
foreshadowing, I'll get back to boundaries from an extra Esther Perel perspective. That
sure.
word's interesting, right?
Yeah.
It has lots of different meanings behind it, but I get what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that got me a little bit in this whole societal thing was to go and say, okay, I have this principle in my mind, you know, that you have to do these breaks. It's just a spiritual principle just overall. But then I had to look at it honestly, and I had to say, well, I have other people I know who live under societal norms and mores, and they're like totally like happy as a clam.
Sure.
So it was a weird thing for me. And again, it seems like a small thing, but it really isn't when you try to like walk your way through it. At least it wasn't for me to go through and say, okay, I think that there's something about breaking with this. But on the other hand, I think I have to not judge people in the sense of the people who are like perfectly fine with this. You
Right.
know, I have
Right.
one old friend. I haven't talked with him about this yet. You know, we've been playing music together since we were like, you know, in junior high or something, you know, the old friend. And like we've known each other since we were 6. And we don't talk all the time, but you know, he's an old friend, and he lives like what I would describe as being a kind of like a quintessential American life in many ways. Works in corporate America, you know, has his wife and kids that are kind of like a big part of his life, obviously. He does his creative music things, but you know, for the most part, his life is pretty like American.
Right.
I wouldn't be able to live his life. And I've known this for years. Like I know this with even with him working in corporate America. I was like, I would like literally like just like toss myself out the window. Like I wouldn't be able to do it, you know.
Mm.
And I used to think, wow, he's such a tough guy. How does he do this? You know? But what I realized, it just wasn't an issue for him. This was fine. He didn't feel a clash, you know, he didn't feel a conflict there. And I'm like, and I wanted to look at this again, I think being clinically honest in myself, going, okay, well, if people don't feel a clash, they don't feel the clash.
Right.
It's totally fine. They don't have to worry about should I stay or should I go. It's an old Clash song. They're
Mm-hmm.
like they can just roll along and like do their thing, you know. And that has been something I've really had to think about because I want to be intellectually honest and emotionally honest person.
Mm-hmm.
I want to accept other people kind of like where they're at, and if that's where the person is, that's cool for cats for them, right? So it's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if that means that people are going to make, in terms of happiness, it's good. Whether or not people are going to make a whole lot of like psycho-spiritual progress. I talked with Ryan Davenport about this, our anthropologist on call.
Mm. Oh, that's
And
right.
and and it was like he raised this point before I did. He was like, well, you know, that might not be the most psycho-spiritually progressing life. And I was like, yeah, I don't know what to say about that. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. It would seem weird for me to say that you can't get enlightened living in like Woodstock, Illinois, up like, you know, hour and a half from Chicago in your small community. Why can't you? That would seem like a bizarre thing.
I have a good friend who lives out there, and actually, I think he's working on it pretty intensely, actually. So
Yeah. So it would seem like just because someone else doesn't see it the same way I do, that would seem kind of like a bizarre thing to say.
right.
Right. And I'm sure there's lots of case studies of really nice Japanese housewives who meditate their Zen and like become enlightened.
Mhm.
So it's fine. You know, it has to be fine. But it was something I really had to think about. I think I'm trying to get what Jung's opinion on this was, because again, I did a really deep dive through this memories, dreams, reflections. And then what I think I get him saying, because he does talk about this at a couple of points, he says something like, if you do feel this clash and you don't kind of go through and actually push it through to express maybe the more authentic person of who you are, you can't blame people because there's a lot of resistance for that if you happen to feel it, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, he kind of goes like, well, at the same time, he kind of says like, well, I can't totally respect that either. You know, if you really feel this and you don't push it through, then, you know, there's no blame, but maybe there's also not like a lot of like applause for that either. He kind of takes that attitude. I'm not sure what I think about that either, but that does seem to be what he's saying. So, and he does have this kind of concern about what it means to be an individual. There's this book of his called The Undiscovered Self.
Mm.
And he talks about like everyone is an individual. He gives this great metaphor of the rocks on the beach. I can't remember if we talked about this one, Daniel, did we? So he says, like, you know, if you do the average of the rocks on the beach, you might find the average weight is like 2 pounds or something for the rocks on the beach or something. But, you know, on any individual rock, if you pick it up, you're not going to get a 2-pound rock.
Right.
All the rocks are going to weigh different amounts. And it's sort of his critique of like statistics and science in a way. You know, every rock is going to be different, you know? And I was like, that's a brilliant way of putting that, you know? And if you found a 2-pound rock, you'd be pretty surprised, right? You know, that you'd be shocked, actually. You expect them all to be different. At the same time, though, because the thought that came next, and I've had this thought as a clinician really for years and years, is that most people are going to be pretty the same and pretty kind of predictable, you know? And so I think what he's saying there is that the reason why people get kind of predictable and kind of more narrow versions of themselves is because there's what Ronk was talking about one of our other episodes, they adapt. Right. And so the behavior gets really, really predictable. Right. And they don't ever express their own individual nature, their own individual rockness. They try to make themselves into the 2-pound rock or something. I think he thinks that that's bad. If you're a 2-pound rock, good for you. Be a 2-pound rock. But if you're not, you got to kind of express your own thing. I think that's what he's trying to say. I know. What do you think about that?
Well, there's kind of 2 points here, right? One is the median doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so I and then the other, you know, I forgot the other part I was going to say, but there's 2 parts there, but so only one part exists, you know. And I think that's like, oh no, accepting of where people are, right? Was the other point.
Yeah, that's true too.
That you know, our oncologist on call, or anthropology, our anthropologist on call, who's not an oncologist, but maybe in another lifetime, you know.
Yeah.
So okay, so on the first part, accepting, yeah, you have to. You don't have a choice, because if you don't accept where people are, then you will struggle with judgment and being critical of them.
That's true. That's
you know,
true.
so you have to, and this goes back to our discussion earlier on agreeing and disagreeing, right? This is so, it's just funny, like that was what I felt was going to be important for this episode, and it keeps coming, you know.
I think that's it. I think that's the hook of it, right?
Yeah, without a doubt, that like, just because you don't hold those same beliefs, again, even if that person is you know, you think like you think, and this could be somebody you love, like I love you and I think you could be living your life at, you know, at a higher functionality. I'm not saying more productive on like a Western sense, like, well, you could produce 10 projects instead of 9. No, I mean, it's like,
many more widgets if you just like could just get your head together.
Right. No, I mean, like a person could be living a happier, more contented life, you know, we'll just say that. And who doesn't want that? Everybody wants that, but they're on their own path. And you cannot simply apply your methodology to their life, just like other people might have the same for us. So it's, you know, it's a circular firing squad on some level.
Yeah.
You know, the only thing, at least in my thought, to do is wait until somebody asks, right? Because then they lower the drawbridge. We've talked about this in the podcast a while back, but like allowing somebody to lower their drawbridge around the protective mechanisms around their mind and around their heart to intentionally and actively allow you in, then you can have influence, but not before. You're just shooting arrows at the castle wall, like bouncing right off constantly. So you have to wait. You have to practice patience.
That's like potentially clinical resistance.
Yeah. You have to have patience. That's it. And so the practice for you then, or for us, or for whoever's listening, is to wait for that opportunity to come, and then when the time comes, to take it, right? So that's kind of part of it. And then finding the middle doesn't really exist, because there's no average person. You know, what is that? What would their name be? You know, what about them is average? You know what
So,
I'm
but, I
saying?
mean, his point is like, the trouble is that, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm still wrestling with this, but the societal thing will squeeze people into a certain shape.
Sure.
That's the weird question. And I don't know where the boundaries are in that and how I think about this. I get
Mm-hmm.
the idea that people are where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he's also raising this point of like, why, and you have this as a clinician, you notice this. So when he said this in the book, I was like, hallelujah, because I had that thought, you know, each person is individual. They have their own, if you want to be really Buddhist about it, they have their own karmic, spiritual about it. They have their karmic things that they're bringing in,
Yeah.
right? That are infinite, kind
Yeah.
of. Yet why does it all kind of produce the same widgets at the end of the social system?
Sure.
Because trying to make things into a certain shape.
Yeah.
So I think that's what he's wrestling with too. And I think I respect him for at least asking the question, you know, because, and it's not an easy one,
Right.
right? Okay, so when I got to the point of really thinking about, okay, where are the points of clash? And it hit me like, okay, I think there's like three major points of conflict that I'm trying to understand. And it's been, I think, a theme in our podcast from the very beginning. Maybe four of them, I'm sorry. So I kind of looked at it as like, well, you can have clashes, and Jung felt this obviously. So we were kind of talking a little bit off mic about this, maybe, where I can kind of relate to Jung because he felt like a clash at almost every single part of his personality with what was being asked of him in the external world. And I guess I feel that too, and probably always have. And he
Mm-hmm.
talks about that feeling that young, and I think I felt that Jung felt that young. And it seems like, yeah, I felt that young too, but not Jung because I didn't know who he was yet. But, you know, so some of it seems to be like in spirituality. So for Jung, you know, he was raised in this very Christian household. His families were all parsons, and he broke, and he went Gnostic and alchemical and probably pagan on some level, right? He still obviously writes a lot about Christianity, but a Christianity that wouldn't look like his father's for sure, you know?
Mm.
And then for me, I went from, you know, being raised Catholic, Christian, first to Zen, and then zoop, the whole thing took off, and I'm like way far away from my starting point,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So I think you could have spiritual clashes where you're like, okay, I don't vibe with the worldview, the spiritual worldview of the culture I'm in.
Right.
It's obvious, like he feels that too. Like he's not Christian and he's not scientific materialist either. So Jung feels that in his life. I mean, probably the reason why he ultimately broke up with Freud in a major way was Freud was like a scientific materialist person representing that part of Western culture. And Jung was like, I'm not.
Mm.
I can't follow this dude. I can't be a representative of his ideas. I don't agree with them. And it's like, it took some cojones to do that. Freud's a much more famous person. He
Right.
could have been this, like, just this guy kind of living under the wings of this other kind of much more dominant figure, right? And just kind of gone along, but
Mm-hmm.
he chose not to. He broke,
Right.
right? And a lot of it had to do with his spirituality.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with the world of work then too. My second big idea. You
Mm.
might feel like I can't work in the way that maybe the society would want me to work. The opportunities it's giving me, I can't accept them. They won't work for me. And that you could kind of, I saw that in Jung too. He goes through multiple work crises. He has to break up with Freud. He has to break up with the university at some level because he's like, I can't teach what the university wants me to teach because I don't believe in it anymore. And I can't represent it properly. And I don't know what else to say. So I'm going to have to go through and I'm going to have to break up with this. Now, he married into a wealthy family. He didn't have the financial concerns that a lot of us would have. A lot of us have to do what we have to do just because, okay, I get by. I can't afford to do that.
Right.
But he obviously recognizes that his life would have been easier if he just would have like stayed in the fold
Mm.
of either the Freud fold or the university academic, maybe more scientific materialist fold. But he feels like he has to break up with them. And he gets a lot of shit about it. There's no doubt that this creates a lot of conflict with people around him, but he did it. So, and I guess it's something that maybe you and I can relate to too, because we were like, well, how are we going to work in this culture? I couldn't
Right.
do what my friend did. I couldn't live his life. I couldn't go to corporate America.
Right.
It would like rot me inside, you know, but other people can. It doesn't feel bad for them. And that's fine. Or maybe it feels bad for them just because they're not against it in principle, but the particular place they are kind of sucks.
Right.
But it's not a point of principle. They're just like in a shitty situation.
Yeah.
And I began to think about this kind of deep because I realized, like, well, some people will feel some intrinsic conflict, like I
Yes.
did, or maybe Jung did. Some people, they don't have like I have friends and family that maybe their work situation sucks, but it's not because they're philosophically against it. It's just because
Yes.
it just turned out kind of funky for them and the
Sure.
environment they're in is kind of toxic. But it's not in principle that it bothers them. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's kind of like being in a bad marriage or something. You might believe in marriage, but yours just happen to be kind of rocky. And so, but it's not because you don't believe in the idea. Stuff like that.
Hmm.
Yeah. I guess raising a family is kind of part of this too. What's your values around raising a family?
Yeah.
I'm taking on the parental roles, but I know for me, I don't know much about this with Jung, to be honest. I'm going to look at one of the deep biographies of Jung to see what he was like as a parent. I'll see if I can find it out because I am curious because I'm trying to write this book. But, the other part is, like, for myself, I know, like, I feel like on some level, I was like, I'm not going to, whatever the American idea of what a parent is supposed to be. And I think there are ideas of it, what you're supposed to be as a mother or a father, what that means, how you're supposed to act. I think there's ideas around that, but I could say for me, I was like, no, I'm not doing that, and I'm going to take the attitude that my kids are kind of like my little soulmates, and I'm going to raise them as if we're kind of like in a mutual soulmate adventure together, which is
Mm.
probably deep to my way of thinking about the world anyways. But I mean, that's a conversation that I've had. I think we talked about it in one of our previous episodes, and with my son, I was like, you're my little soulmate. You're one of my little, like, cachet of soulmates. And I'm going to learn from you, and you're going to learn from me, and we're going to go back and forth. It's not just like you're
Hmm.
going to be learning from me. I'm going to learn from you. Right. And I tell them that a lot. We're in this shared thing together. Sometimes I'll have to be like, I'm the dad. You have to do what I say. Sorry.
Right. Get in the car.
But in others, get in the car, put your shoes on. We got to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, but it's also like, this is how I communicate with my kids, and I don't know if that's probably not the way most people would do it, but it fits into how I see the world. Right. And then I guess the last one of these that would be big with how you think about relationships, which is obviously our major topic of this series. So I see 4 major ways. I don't know if you have other ideas with that, Daniel. If you do, I'm interested, but I kind of see those as like the 4 major aspects of life where you might be like, okay, cool. This is how the society is. This doesn't bother me. I'm rolling along. I'm good.
Mm.
Or you might feel like, nah, this doesn't work for me. I'm going to grind against this. What do you think? I think there's anything major I missed there off the top of your head?
No, not major. Um, just point. Yeah, I mean, other points. I think probably they're all going to fall under the spirituality heading. I don't think that society pushes creativity.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's such a huge part of people's lives, whether they realize it or not. And if it's there, then it's a huge part, and when it's not there, it's a gaping hole. And it doesn't necessarily mean like getting a brush and painting on an easel, doing things creatively, but even just having the idea that, like, that's the place that you do that. And I have some patients, when I ask them about where do they get to practice their creativity, they're like, oh, actually it's through my work via problem solving. That's where my creative outlet comes. So they enjoy working because they are able to do that in that way, and that's how they do that for them. But they're conscious of it, and so they're using it as an outlet. So sometimes you don't even have to do anything different, actually, externally, but the way that you
It's funny,
approach it.
Daniel. My childhood friend I was talking about who works in the corporate world, it's exactly the ad. He says those exact words.
Yeah, and I've heard it a couple of times, and I'm not doing that, but I can respect it, because then I ask them, okay, well, tell me about it, and they do, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, no, that absolutely is creative. It's just in a different medium, and
I
so
think
I'm
Jung
not
might
gonna.
take the attitude of like, you should do some of that more in your personal life too, but that's just, Jung being Jung.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And
Yeah.
so in this way, the discussion is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we want to bring it to the forefront of your mind, so this way that's what you're doing, you know? Um, and I think, yeah, I think that prioritization probably of oneself, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so all of, like, so which again maybe fall under
That
spirituality.
probably falls under spirituality, but but it's a good one to mention, obviously, right?
Yeah, I just, because I don't know where that, I mean, it could be, but that could also
I
be.
think Jung sees spirituality as the creation of a self or something, the discovery and creation of yourself.
Sure.
I mean, he kind of says that, his whole life. Well, I think he kind of says like has been an exploration of the unconscious, but like also this exercise of individuation.
Right. And in this way, then making yourself a priority via your spiritual practice if you want to, or nowadays, especially with via work and boundaries around work, or finding work that expresses who you are, or finding work that gives you time or freedom to do what it is that you want to do, or, however that works for you, and then the same thing going with the family and within your relationships, that you're going to find things that are going to foster your ability to do the dive within yourself. Society does not, they do not, that there is no talk of any of that. There is no, like if you work for some place, you might get a sick day, or vacation time. But, if you want like to go on retreat, you take your vacation time for that. No one's asking you, what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
How's that book that you're, what I'm saying? Like,
How's that young book coming? Yeah, no
right,
one's going to say that.
right.
But it's kind of, I mean, that goes to the point. There's some societal problem in this that you're going to have to look at some way or another.
Yeah.
There's something there you're going to have to look at.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So the next big thing for me was this idea of, and what I really kind of hit me was, I think it's just a question of like a difference in underlying worldview, foundational worldview, and maybe even like metaphysics or something, that people see the world in like radically different ways. Again, I've been trying to talk with people about this the entire time we've been doing. I talk about people with our episodes all the time, but specifically these. And I got to the point where, and then looking at Jung too. And I was like, well, obviously Jung just has a different view of how the world works.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't think like Freud. He's not a Darwinian, evo psych person. He doesn't think like his dad. He doesn't see the world through that Christian frame. He sees the world differently. It's like an actual metaphysics that says the world is just not what these two points of views think it is. And so I have my own way of thinking what the world means, what it is. I just see it differently. And I think what I find so fascinating about that is that then kind of permeates through everything, that ripples through everything. Because if you have a different metaphysics, then what you think family means, what you think work means, what you think love relationships mean, any of these things mean, is just different. Like you just don't see the world through the same framework. I don't have the view of like my grandma, who would be like the major Christian figure in the household that I grew up in. And I don't have the view of my dad either, who's like, would look at himself as being sort of probably like a biological materialist person. I don't have their worldview, and those are probably the dominant worldviews in this culture. So I'm not going to like match. And I guess that's what I kind of see in Jung too. He was eventually like, I don't match with these folks.
Mm-hmm.
And it like affects everything. He's going to think differently about work. He's going to think differently about love, relationships, family. I don't know as much about how he handled his kids. I'll try to find out. But like the whole thing is just going to be different. It's a different metaphysics.
Right.
That makes sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's pretty deep actually, once you really think about it.
Yeah.
I've had conversations with friends and I'm like, ultimately now I'm just saying like, well, listen, our metaphysics of the world are not the same.
Right.
You're a biological materialist. There's no argument for us to have. We can debate maybe, but our core way of seeing things is just different. So I'm never going to be able to agree with you. And it's not like you're illogical. Everything you're saying is perfectly logical. There's nothing for me to argue with. It's fine. I just, we have to accept that we don't see the world the same way.
Right.
I don't think the world works the way you think the world works.
Correct.
There's other levels or other aspects of reality for me that you don't think exist. Right. So we just don't see the world the same way. And so we're not going to think about parenting the same way. I have to believe that my son is incarnated in many, many lives.
Well, the other part,
many abilities. We've met before. Sometimes he'll be my dad. Sometimes I'll be his dad. Sometimes we'll be friends. That's a different worldview. So it's going to change the way I function as a parent.
The other thing you asked me what was another one that you might have missed in terms of this clashing.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to call. What I want to say is time, but we can also say resources. But we're going to just keep it for time, because the way in which you're viewing time is that there's this reincarnating thing, but that means that time is different, right? Yeah. Our existence and our relationship to it varies. And that is not something that society talks about. You know, at least in Western wise, we view like youth as the prime, right? Youth as the peak. And then as that goes away, more time, more old, bad, not good, you know? And at some other time, it might have been different. You know, who knows why that's the way that it is. I'm not totally sure. But I think the way in which you view that can change how you do all the other things, which includes how you spend it, right?
Yeah.
How do you spend it looking at yourself, how you spend it working, how you spend it, you know, raising your kids, all the other stuff. I think, and maybe because I'm reading that book by Diane
You sound very
Katagiri.
zenny.
Right.
You sound very zenny.
But I think
Uh-huh.
it reframes your perspective with things, actually, you know, and it's a continual reminder of this, like, things are events, you know, that have a beginning, a middle, and an end to them. And sometimes they're longer or shorter, but based on where you are in relation to them, you're also part of that event. And all these things are happening at the same time, whatever. But it's going to be finished at some point, you know? And so how do you prepare yourself for that? And if you're living kind of oblivious to that, then your actions are going to be different in the world and with other people. And if you're conscious of that, I think then your actions and your interactions with in the world and with other people will be different as well.
Well, if like my friend, I'm thinking of someone in particular now, is like a biological materialist, he's going to say like, okay, he basically thinks human beings are kind of like little AI robots, right? Mm-hmm. So he'll describe me as like a Buddhist chat GTP. Mm-hmm. You know, that's how he thinks. And I'm like, well, that's a different worldview entirely. Mm-hmm. And he likes to be logical. And I'm like, but there's nothing wrong with your logic. Our premises are different. You know, like our axioms are not the same, right? So the time frame is different. You're right, because I was telling my son, you know, he was kind of feeling down in this, you know, it's an episode we did before, but he was kind of feeling a little maudlin and existentially troubled, like he was some French philosopher, like chain smoking in a beret in Paris. What's the meaning of anything? What's the purpose? All our lives are going to end. And I was like, no. You knew me before. You'll know me again. Some way or another, this is our time together. It's my job to help you. It's your job to help me. We love each other. We're little soulmates helping each other. That's a different framing entirely. Mm-hmm. And it's going to mean something differently how you think about love. Mm-hmm. It's going to mean something differently about how you think about like work, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to see that the same way. It's just different, you know? He could say, well, what's the point of me building up these skills? You know, I'm just going to die someday. And I was like, no, the skills you bring up now are going to carry with you into other experiences you're going to have in other lifetimes. Those are latent talents you're going to have. I have his chess stuff in the background. That's why you can play chess. Why this is so easy for you, relatively speaking. I mean, he's not Magnus Carlsen or something, but he could play relatively easily. Why? Because you know this already. Mm-hmm. You're just remembering something that you already knew. You know, I mean, Plato talks that way too, right? The stuff that you know you're remembering, right? Because you built up those potentialities at other times. That's how it is.
I mean, I've said it.
Gone. That's time, right? It's a different view on time, right?
I've said it before, like the learning, the kind of like the breath of fresh air in your brain mind when you learn something new, to me feels exactly the same as when you remember something. Yeah. Oh, you know what I'm saying? When it hits you, yeah. an epiphany. Yeah. An epiphany and a memory moment, are like, floop, 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 floop. They're like two sides of the same coin, you know?
Very close.
So the question is like, are you learning?
Very similar. Mm-hmm.
Are you learning it or are you remembering it?
Yeah. Jung has that funny thing too, that I think is very close to your spirit, where he's like, I had it in the dream, therefore it's true. Because that's my collective unconscious talking to me. It's letting me know something through the dream. I didn't create that. Some people would say, well, that's just a creation of your own mind. Jung says, no. You're learning something in that dream state, you know, that wasn't really produced by you. That's why it's so reliable, because your conscious ego mind didn't produce it. That's a certain view of the world.
That's right.
Right? Yeah. So anyways, we're getting to the end of this episode, and it's a total ripoff because I didn't do my big reveal.
No, I mean, this is the plan.
Yeah. So I think the last thing I wanted to say about this one is we get to the closer, because you got a hard break in 5 minutes. But
yes,
to me, what I really wanted to say, and we've probably already said it, was the purpose of these episodes we've been doing for me has been a lot of like looking at myself and looking at where I feel potential clashing conflict, you know, this non-concordance between myself and the environment, right? That's an important issue for me. And so I want to talk about my own version of this. We'll do this like next week in the love and relationship field. But I wanted to talk about, especially because, you know, beyond my own personal concerns, I think everyone's going to have this thing, right? Where there might be other aspects where they don't vibe with what's being asked of them, asked of them. So I wanted to like just really say that that was kind of the main idea of this whole preamble thing for me. It's not just, you know, so, you know, we can talk about ourselves or something.
Right.
Okay. Who cares? It's more like, okay, we could reveal things that are our own points of what we're trying to figure out, what we're trying to wrestle with, where we feel like we clash or don't clash again, how we're trying to resolve that in different ways. That might be the things that matter to you and me might resonate with some people because they have the same things, right? They might feel those same conflicts in the same areas of life. But even if you don't, it's the bigger issue. You know, the point of doing the episodes in part is to say, yeah, there's something where you might feel this conflict. And it's like maybe like the way Jung felt in this area of life, this is unavoidable. I have to do this thing, even though I know this is going to create conflict and my life might be easier if I didn't do it this way, but I have to do it. And I think that's the point of empathy that I wanted to try to build here with this. Now, wherever that is for anyone who might be listening to this episode, you know, you might not feel it in the same places that I do or Daniel does or whatever. But if you do feel that someplace, this is an episode for you in the sense that we can empathize with this idea, right? And you have to wrestle with this. Right, does that seem like that's logical too?
Yeah.
Probably it does.
Yeah.
I think the Otto Rank thing was something like you can either adapt, but if you adapt in a way that's artificial, it's going to be bad, right? What he essentially says, Daniel, is it's going to kill your creativity. You know, it's going to kill some part of your creative spirit. You're going to lose it because the adapting will be artificial and will cut you off from the deeper parts of yourself. He says sometimes you go through periods where people will get kind of anxious, neurotic, nervous, and it can be a good thing because that's the moment where you realize like, okay, my adaptation isn't working. I have to do something different. And in the moment of feeling that you have to do something different, you might feel afraid, anxious, even guilty on some level, right? Why should I not do what my family said? Why should I not do what, you know, other people are doing? Why should I, who am I? You know, why am I entitled to do this? You know, but the idea is that like, that's the kind of an artificial guilt. And then you get to go your own way. Then you get to like tap into your own creativity, whatever that means for you, something like that. That's my capper on that part. What do you got on that? I think we agree generally, right?
Yeah. We'll have to agree to disagree. No, we're not.
After all this shit, you're like, no, this is total bullshit. I'm never doing this podcast again. You just pull the mic out, shut the whole shop down.
Slam it up. Yeah. No,
it's an interesting point.
Yeah, no, and
I think what's cool, he says that's where people feel neurotic. Where you feel nervous, anxious, afraid, guilty is sometimes the best place to be. Because that tells you where you actually want to, like, you don't want to adapt in that spot. And it creates anxiety, fears, like guilts, and so on. This is like my first experience with like Buddhism. You know, I came up with my kids this week. They were like, well, how did you first get interested in Buddhism? I was watching Joseph Campbell, our beloved Joseph Campbell, you know, great mythic philosopher. And he was telling the 3 trials of the Buddha. The first one was not to succumb to fear. The second was not to succumb to like artificial desires, right? Don't get swayed away by artificial desires. But the third one was really fascinating me when I was watching this when I was a kid. We talked about this in previous episodes probably, but it fits in here, where the big one was the last trial of the Buddha was like, who are you to go through and break with what your dad wants you to do, what society wants you to do? Who are you to do that? What about your duties and your societal roles? And you're supposed to be a prince and blah, blah, blah. And Buddha had to go, no, I'm not going to do that either. And he broke. Right. So it's this moment of like, you know, being able to say, okay, this is the place where I have to break. If you have to, if you don't, you're cool. It's interesting.
It is very much so.
Yeah.
Well, Eric,
all right, cool. You got a boogie.
Yep. But good stuff. And so, you know, we'll continue with Eric's big reveal next week.
It's probably be like anticlimactic. People like, wah, wah, nothing.
Well, you know, whatever. That's what
it'll be probably the culmination of a relationship series, probably.
Yes.
And then whatever you feel about this stuff too, Daniel. Probably it's where we'll kind of finish this whole series up.
Yeah. And then we could get back to talking semi trucks. Whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway,
talk about politics then and then
we'll yeah, for sure. We'll talk about what's his face, Ramaswamy. I don't know. Who knows?
Oh yeah, that guy who
that
I forget
guy.
his name actually.
It doesn't matter.
Mini younger Trumpian guy who's
who knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, but that we could totally not do that. Boo, not gonna do that. Anyways, Eric, as always, thank you so much for being on here. Audience, thank you for listening. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you for rocking with us. If you've been with us for the last 3 years or the last 3 minutes, you know, we're appreciative of everything. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, hit us up, ginandtantra@gmail.com, or hit us up on the Instagram, Gin and Tantra. If you're watching this or on the YouTube, then, you know, like, comment, subscribe. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, leave a review. It helps the show. Feel free to feel obligated to share, encourage, maybe is better, to share with friends, family, enemies, frenemies, or coworkers, or people you don't even know. It helps out the show. You know, this is a labor of love, and we love all y'all for listening. So for Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.